Hi, Jamie. This is Ira. I am recording here some audio feedback on your statement of belief regarding good argument that I hope will be helpful as you complete your final revisions on the Defining Good Argument in Digital Contexts essay. And as you obviously are well aware, you already wrote this, what is good argument, with an eye to digital contexts. So there's going to be some ways of kind of transforming this from its current status to its next status. That'll be a little easier for you than some other people, which is nice. Still, I have a few things I kind of want to push you on and maybe challenge you a little bit with that I think will be useful while you're working on that larger, more systematic theoretical argument. To be clear, I'm not saying that there's any problem with the statement of belief per se. It's a perfectly good version of what it is. Rather, my thoughts here, my responses here are meant to help you ensure that your Defining Good Argument in Digital Contexts, your major essay, is as deeply systematic and theoretically rigorous as possible. So, with that in mind, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read back through your essay, highlight some things that I think are particularly strong, or spots where I want to push you a little bit. So here we go. So, generally, a good argument is persuasive. So first off, what happens in a good argument is that it persuades, or it is persuasive, which is related but maybe not exactly the same. And it might be interesting to say, well, what's the difference between persuading and being persuasive? Are they the same? Are they not the same? And I think you can argue that both ways. Then you say it takes account of both the pros and cons, as well as providing reasonable evidence and justification. Now, I think all that's fair enough. One of the things that you don't really do yet here is talk about what constitutes reasonable evidence. Is there some general standard? Are there norms that you would urge on other people? And what constitutes a reasonable justification? What is justification? Why does it matter? Who cares? And I'm asking these questions in part because one of the things you really highlight throughout this statement of belief is that the way that we think about good argument is very personal. And I think you're totally right. It is very personal. And yet, our sense of reason has somehow to interact with other people's sense of reason if we're going to be persuasive. So, what I want to kind of encourage you to do in your Defining Good Argument in Digital Context essay is to really think about, again, what constitutes reasonable evidence and justification. What makes some kinds of evidence reasonable and other kinds of evidence not? What makes some justifications reasonable and others not? Throughout this essay, you talk a lot about how audiences shape those questions. And I think you're totally right. I mean, that's definitely, for the study of rhetoric in general, that's a foundational idea that audiences shape the value and meaning and significance of arguments. So I certainly agree. And yet, you have your sense of goodness in argument, and I want to encourage you to work that out a little more fully. One of the things that you set up here as kind of a sine qua non, that without which not, for good argument, is listening. And you go through and talk about how all good arguments start with an open mind for both participants, and that good arguments literally cannot happen once someone stops listening. And I think that's probably true one-on-one. I'm curious, though, what about arguments where two people are going back and forth and they're only sort of talking to each other, they're also performing for some audience? So, for instance, two people arguing on Reddit, on the one hand, they really are arguing with each other, but they're also making statements that they hope other people will see and agree with. Can good argument happen then, even if one of the parties is not listening? And if so, what does that look like? Also, I mean, similarly, like political debates in some ways, right, between say presidential candidates or senatorial candidates or whatever, don't exactly involve a very open mind on either part, and yet they presumably can be good arguments, or maybe they can't by your definition. So those would be a couple things to think about for the definition itself. What about arguments that are performed for some third party or multiple third parties? And so for instance, I think your example here of a bad argument where the digital medium, sort of makes it harder to make a good argument, in part because of an ambiguity about identity. That's a good instance of bad argument. I'm totally sold on it. And I'm also kind of curious, in this instance, if Sally's and Jake's argument is public in some way, is it possible that there would be still some goodness to her argument, even though he's not listening? And if so, what would that look like? And why? And if not, why not? Since, again, we often do perform our arguments for third parties. When you say arguments turn emotional and offensive, those seem to me like they're at least potentially two distinct things. Because for me, sometimes a very emotional argument can be very powerful, and I would value quite a bit some emotional arguments, and I wonder if you would agree. So I'd be interested to know more about how you see the relationship between emotional arguments and offensive arguments. Are they necessarily the same thing, or not necessarily? And I wanted to just say, I love this. A good argument consists of deterministic screens with a limited deflection capability. I think it's such an interesting idea. I'd like it a lot. I'd like to hear more about it. You do offer a little bit of an explanation, in other words, but I'd really want to see you expand on that and fill that idea out more fully. I think you're saying something really pretty interesting and kind of novel in some ways, and I'd just love to hear you fill out the idea more. Now, here at the end, you are talking about multiple audiences. You're talking about how the difficulty of speaking to and addressing multiple audiences and what that looks like, and that's something I think you're very much correct about, that being an important part of digital contexts. And I'd like to hear more about how you see that working, again, especially with regard to persuasive qualities, supporting evidence, and open-mindedness. To what extent are persuasive qualities different from offensive qualities? What about when offensive qualities are persuasive to some audiences? Is that acceptable or not acceptable? Why? And so then ultimately, one of the things I'm looking for in the defining good argument in digital context is a much fuller sense of why. Why do you think that the things that you think are good, and why do you think that the things you think are bad are bad? What makes these good, or what makes these bad per se? At the end of the day, although I agree that we have very different views, the goal here is for you to develop your views. And so, part of that is kind of clarifying the mechanism of action that makes certain things good or bad as you see it. So I enjoyed reading this piece, and I am really looking forward to reading the longer essay. Thanks.